Ruben, right when you're ready, go ahead, take it
Sure.
away. Okay.
Okay, so thank you again to all you guys who are here, and we expect a few more will join. We want this to be interactive in the sense, not in the sense that we're going to have multiple people talking, but we want to hear your questions. So those of you who are attending are probably a mixture of students, maybe second years who are looking to take step one in the next few months and are trying to figure out how to deal with these new NBMEs. Some of you may be learning advisors or other stakeholders in step one who are looking to advise students, and so we want this to be helpful to you as well. So basically what we're trying to do here, the goal of this webinar is to do two things. One, to summarize early findings of ours of the exams, as Dr. Restramer has mentioned. We've spent a lot of time as a company analyzing these exams. That's one of the things I've done for many years as part of our work with tutoring and working with our tutors and working with students and trying to really understand the patterns and the question design. And when there's such an update like we've had or we're having right now with all these new exams, it's something that causes a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty with students. We've been publishing a lot of blog posts because students are constantly asking us for our thoughts on these, on the question of what to do with the new NBMEs and whether they're the same, whether they're better, whether they're different, or what have you. And so, we've been trying to disseminate as much information as possible. And this webinar is the next step for us to sort of share more of our thoughts and give as much direction as we can. So we're going to summarize early findings from these new exams. 3 exams were released on March 25th, forms 20, 21, and 22, for those of you who don't know. And the next 2 exams, 24 and 25, are going to be released later in spring. We believe that's likely April or May, but no one knows the date except for the NBME, and no one really knows what the NBME is doing half the time, so we'll have to wait on them. And then the most important thing is to not just give you our thoughts on the tests in terms of the content, but offer recommendations. You guys who are out there listening, we want you to walk away from today with a better idea of how you're going to organize your own studying, how you're going to think about NBMEs, and if you're an advisor, how you're going to advise students about the exams. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing on these exams. The first thing we're seeing is that there are a number of repeat questions, and this is something that students have noticed right away. Some of our tutors who've already worked with students who've taken the new exams in the past week have pointed out to us. We want to be clear, though, in terms of the repeat questions, first of all, where they come from. A lot of these questions come from the recently retired exams, which are 13, 15, 16, and 19. We haven't noticed significant repeats or really, more than a question or two from the older NBMEs that we spent a lot of time analyzing. And so it's pretty, it's not surprising that the tests that were retired that can no longer be taken, some of the questions from those tests are used. That does not mean that the new tests are somehow just regurgitated content, that there's no use to them. I would say, less than 10% of the questions are recycled, maybe even closer to 5%. The vast majority of them are new. And that's important because if they were all recycled and you already had access to the old NBMEs, that might be a reason not to bother so much with the new ones. So what are we seeing with these questions? So the questions to us look a lot like the questions from NBME 19. And in our blogs, we've been talking a lot. We've been writing a lot about Form 19. Because there's so much uncertainty with all these NBMEs and because not a lot of the rationale is explained, medical students and stakeholders in this process tend to make a lot of assumptions about what's going on. And one assumption that we've noticed over the past few years, going back to when Form 19 was released in spring of 2017, was that Form 19 was the newest form at that time, and therefore it must be the best form. It must be the most representative test form. I must have the best questions, and it must be the form that students should take right before their exam in order to assess whether they're ready to meet their score goal. And although that's very plausible just from a rational point of view, when of course the NBME is going to update their materials and make it more like the real step one, we did not find that to be the case at all. We found NBME 19 to have some very hard questions, very almost strange questions that you couldn't find the answer to in first aid, could hardly find the answer to by searching online in journals and other resources. We also found that the scores that Form 19 were spitting out were way lower than what our students were scoring on comparable NBMEs, other test forms like 18 and 17, and also much lower than they were scoring on the real exam. So that was the basis for our recommendation for students to not ever use 19 as the ultimate or the final practice test before the real exam. If anything, take it earlier in the process. And we were very curious as we began our early analysis to investigate whether the new forms 20, 21, and 22 were similar to 19, or maybe represented some departure, some new style, or maybe a return to the older style. What we found is that the new test forms feel a lot like NBME 19 in the sense that there's some very hard questions. There's specifically many clinically oriented questions. And what we have here, these second two bullet points, clinically oriented questions and new questions on old topics. And I'm going to walk you through that so you understand what I mean by that. And also we have some examples here that will illustrate that. But something that you may have heard that we have found to be true, both anecdotally and from these new exams, is that the step one questions are getting more clinical. Some students understand that to mean that the vignettes are getting longer in the sense that step two and step two vignettes are very long. That we do not find to be the case. The length of the questions on 20, 21, 22, the same length generally as the questions on all the past NBMEs, including the retired ones. What we are noticing though is that the language of the vignettes, the histories that are given are much more clinical. We've noticed questions that deal with trauma, a few questions on pelvic fractures and axillary vein thrombosis, and some really complicated clinical concepts that were not tested previously on step one. And as a few examples we put here, MR angiography. Now, but we're fortunate to have Dr. Bruce Stramer on, who's listening, and he's going to join in a little bit later. As a practicing radiologist, he deals with all sorts of imaging modalities, including ordering MRIs and angiographies, and specifically for treating or for diagnosing renal artery stenosis or part of the workup. It's a test that's commonly used, and he has seen it. In terms of exam settings, we had previously only seen that question on a step two or a step three question. Step two and step three are much more about workup and next steps. For the first time on the new NBMEs, we saw a question that asked the student to know, or required the student to know, that MR angiography was the workup choice for a certain vascular condition. We had never seen that before on a step one question. Similarly, we saw anemia of chronic disease being tested in the context of an autoimmune condition. I won't say which one, just to not give away too much, but the connection between anemia of chronic disease and this certain inflammatory condition had only been seen in the context of a step two or a step three question. So these are examples. There are many more examples that we've noticed so far. So basically, step one is in fact looking a little bit more like step two from these NBMEs that we're seeing so far. Not so much in the length, but more in the level of question and the content of the questions. So that's one thing. What else are we seeing so far from analyzing these three exams? What we're seeing is that the NBME is trying to ask new questions. And this is always a point of confusion. And it's very important for us to clarify here. And you guys can take this advice as you will and share it with peers and classmates. There's a lot of sense among students that whatever the topics are on the newer NBMEs are the topics that are most valued by step one. And that is not the case based on our extensive experience with this. Similarly, for those of you, when you will take step one, when you walk out of step one, you might tell your friend, wow, I had a lot of neuro, a lot of biochem, a lot of immuno on my exam. What about your exam? And they'll say, oh, I hardly had any neuro. I hardly had any biochem. I had a lot of GI and micro. And you hear stories like this all the time where the experiences of students walking out of these exams is not uniform. And similarly, the questions and the topics that we see tested on the new exams, we believe that it is not appropriate to infer that these are somehow more valued topics. But what we are seeing on these new exams is that the NBME seems to be reaching, so to speak, into its bag of tricks, or going deeper into the differential to test common diseases in order to create new questions. If you think about it, we've been analyzing these exams since it was NBME Form 1. Now we're on 22. We're going to be on 24. there are only so many ways to test the same concepts. And so what we did here is we just gave you a sampling of concepts just so you understand exactly what we're talking about. And I know that by and large, we have a medical audience here. We have a student audience. So I want to be really clear in terms that you'll understand, because you guys have just come through a whole year of pathophys and pathology. So acute pancreatitis, it's one of the highest yield topics on step 1. There are tons of questions. You will see at least a couple of questions on pancreatitis, acute and chronic, I should say, on your exam. Now, there's a whole long list of possible causes of acute pancreatitis. There's a mnemonic in first aid. Some of you may remember it, I get smashed. We haven't seen scorpion bites causing pancreatitis on any of the USMLE exams, but there are common causes that are tested again and again, mainly alcohol and gallstones. If you look at any NBME, going back to the earliest NBMEs, those are by and large the causes of pancreatitis. There is a third cause of acute pancreatitis that can be tested, and it's hypertriglyceridemia from an apolipoprotein deficiency or some genetic defect. In the past, this was rarely tested, but for some reason, on each of the new NBMEs, there's a question that deals with hyperlipidemia causing acute pancreatitis. Not gallstones, not alcohol, not the other causes, hyperlipidemia. And so why is that the case? What we think is going on is that the NBME is trying, as I said before, to test concepts that are commonly tested in innovative ways. And so it's not that all of a sudden there's an epidemic of high triglycerides causing pancreatitis and they want to convey that, or that reflects what the test will be. They're trying to diversify, most likely, their pool of questions. And so this is what they're doing. And other examples that we've noticed, peripartum cardiomyopathy. It's a condition of pregnant women right around delivery, sometimes after delivery, and it's basically a CHF picture. We had never seen it before on a step 1 question, and now all of a sudden there are a number of questions on this. And again, it's not that this is now the most important condition, but this is it's a cause of systolic heart failure that hadn't really been covered. So the NBME is trying to broaden the topics that it covers. Iron overdose causing metabolic acidosis. It's one of the lower yield mud piles associations, and other examples too. We don't need to go through all of them, but the idea that you can take away from this is not that these topics are suddenly more important, and that if you don't take the newer NBMEs and learn these topics, you won't know what's going to be tested. It's just that the NBMEs as a whole, across all the forms, are trying to cover the different material that's out there. And they're really looking to come up with new questions, because at some point you run out of questions. And we feel like both that and the fact that they're asking more clinical questions is significant for this, that they're really, if you run out of step 1 questions, it's only logical that maybe you're going to ask some step 2 questions. So what does that mean? So one of the recommendations that we're taking away from this is that first aid and UWorld are as important as ever. And this may seem like a strange thing to be saying. I mean, this webinar is about the new NBMEs. We're talking about new NBMEs. Why are we bringing up first aid and UWorld? We're bringing it up because these lower yield topics, lower yield etiologies of commonly tested conditions that we're seeing on new NBMEs, they have one thing in common. They're found in first aid. It may only be a little blurb in first aid, but it's in first aid. There are very few questions from these new tests that we've seen that cannot be correlated to first aid. And it's important to mention, because although these days there's so many new resources, and when we make study schedules for our students and we're coaching students, we're helping to organize their materials, their resources, Pathoma, Sketchy, Boards and Beyond, Osmosis, Amboss, UWorld, all these different materials, and they're great. But what can happen, and we've actually noticed this a little bit in the courses we teach at Mount Sinai and in interacting with other students, that students seem to sort of be forgetting about first aid. There's sort of a sense of, I can't even read that book. It's overwhelming, it's too much. I want to watch videos, I want to do all these other things. And we think, based on certainly, our experience, but even more so on what we've seen from these new exams, that doubling down on first aid, recommitting to first aid, really making sure you know everything that's in there, there's nothing that will serve you better for your USMLE Step 1 exam than doing that. Because however erratic the NBME can be in its questions, however clinical it can tweak its questions, which we're seeing now, that content is 99% in first aid. And if you know what's in first aid, you're going to do very well and you're going to be well served. The other resource is UWorld. Now, this is no surprise. We're not here to tell you that UWorld is a great resource. You guys presumably are all using UWorld, or you have been using it. But although any given NBME form will only focus on a subset of questions, some low yield, some only searchable in journals, some maybe too clinical, UWorld will give you the full spectrum. And when Dr. Bruce-Ramer and I were medical students, UWorld was around. Maybe there were 1,600 questions, 1,700 questions. Every year they add to the QBank, they make it better, they make it more interactive, they make it more comprehensive. At last count, this past month, 2,700 questions are in UWorld Step 1 QBank. If you include the UWorld assessment exams, that's 3,000 questions. These are 3,000 questions that cover all the material in first aid and cover all the material that you're seeing on the NBMEs. And what does that all mean if we put that together? So what that means is if you have limited time, which many of you do, one of our core recommendations is going to be not to stress about doing all of the NBMEs. These newer forms that are released, for all the reasons we're saying, they're very hard. They are asking new things, but maybe they're not the things that are ultimately going to be on your exam. The scores are not correlated necessarily. Anecdotally, they may be very hard and underpredict, just like Form 19. We don't really know what's going on with these new NBMEs, but what we do know is that UWorld has all the information, tests you in an interactive way, has great explanations, and is correlated with first aid. So if you're not sure what to do with NBMEs, if you're not sure, do I need to do all exams? I purchased all the old exams. Should I just do 4 to 6 exams like I would have done otherwise? What we're saying to you is do not stress about that. Make sure in your limited time that you're doing a really great job with UWorld, making at least 1 pass, maybe 1.5 or 2 passes if possible, and make sure you're doing a really good job with first aid. Don't forget about that, because generations of medical students have aced their boards with first aid and UWorld, and in spite of these new exams, we don't expect that has changed at all. The second recommendation that we have here, and this is the last slide, we really want to keep this short so that there's space for you guys to pose questions, and I can see a number of you are posing questions in the chat box. Because the new NBMEs are totally untested in terms of their score prediction, because they feel like Form 19, which has been so problematic, we would recommend relying on the older NBMEs to assess whether you're ready to take Step 1. Many of you are unsure whether you're going to meet your score goals. For some of you, that might be, I'm not sure I'm going to pass the exam. For others, it might be I want a 220 or 230 or whatever the score is, and I want to take an NBME, a week to 2 weeks before my exam to see where I am. We have no idea what these new forms are going to tell you, and no one is going to know until after this testing cycle is over. So if you're a second-year student or in a position where you're taking Step 1, if you've purchased the older NBMEs, and that was our advice before, and we wanted to give you that advice weeks before the March 25 deadline because we felt like this would be the case, and we feel even more strongly now, make sure you save some of those old exams, whether 18 or 17 or 16, even 15, make sure you save them for when you absolutely need the best score guidance to assess whether you're ready to take the test and meet your goals. You can certainly work through the newer test forms. There's a lot of good content in there, and that heavy clinical style is going to be useful, but the key with NBMEs has always been the score predictiveness. And because we know the old tests are more tried and true, you really want to save those for closer to your exam and maybe work through the newer exams earlier. So Marcel, have you been fielding some questions here? Do you have any thoughts on, because some of this is maybe new to you because you haven't, you're a busy clinician and handling many affairs. You haven't had as much of a time to really dig deep into these tests yet. Do you have any thoughts or questions or anything you think our students and listeners out there would want to hear about?
So yeah, so great. This is fantastic information. I love the discussion of the specific points and the disease topics. And it's great. Those are some of the things. Like obviously, I'll try to make sure we cover some of those differentials when we do our course at Mount Sinai next month for Step 1. One of the things that I've been seeing a lot of. One of the things I've been seeing a lot of online as I've been sort of checking is that there's a mixed bag in terms of the score prediction with regards to NBME 20, 21, and 22. of the three tests, was there any differentiator between them that suggested one of them might be the most sort of reasonable or best distributed, at least in terms of content?
That's a great question. We haven't noticed any difference so far in terms of the distribution of content. As I said, the content is unevenly distributed, just kind of as a rule. No NBME form is designed to be a perfect sampling of step one. It's more in aggregate that you really start to get a sense of how the USMLE is testing the different concepts. In terms of which is the most reliable from a score prediction point of view, that wasn't part of our analysis over the past week. We didn't have our tutors actually take the exams or have do any kind of survey where the control group and survey group take the exam. What we did was mostly just analyze the questions and use our experience with these exams to come to our own conclusions. We're not really going to know about which test is more predictive until our own students start, taking these exams and also take the real exam, and then we get that feedback. That's unfortunately not going to be for a few months. So for now, what we would say is 20, 21, and 22, you can assume that they're interchangeable. No one is better than the other. And you can assume that they are more like Form 19, as we've been saying.
Yeah, so an excellent question comes from a student who I guess is at a school that is where their testing window is going to be after the expiration date of the old exam. So it means that they're going to be after the June 20, their test date is going to be well after the June 25th or June 24th cutoff date. So just to explain for those who don't understand, if you bought your old exams, Form 17, 16 on the very last day, say March 24th, the last day that you could take them is 90 days later. So that would be June 24th. And if your test date is say a month or month and a half after that, what should they do? That's the question. So how can they get a reliable score prediction? Would we maybe switch to a year-old self-assessment or
so that's
NBME?
We always recommend that our students take the UWorld self-assessments because any UWorld questions are great and the explanations are great, and you're going to learn from them. What you hear on the message boards when people talk about their scores on UWorld tests and how they related to their actual score, our experience is consistent with that. Most students say that UWorld self-assessment number 2, UWSA 2, is more reliable than 1 and close to their exam, and we have found that with our students. So leaving the second UWorld assessment test for closer to the real exam, that's a completely reasonable thing to do. Also, if the NBMEs are going to expire before your test date, you can still maybe take 1 or 2 of them. Certainly you can use one of them to set a baseline for yourself, and having an accurate baseline is pretty important, just like having an accurate sense before your exam is important. So you can still work them in there, and by May, we should have a better sense of these newer NBMEs, and we'll have more data about how students are scoring. So there won't be as much of a mystery. And if it seems like NBME 20 overpredicts or underpredicts scores by 20 points or 15 points, then you can make that correction on your own. Our experience for Form 19 has been it generally underpredicts scores by 10 to 15 points. Having said that, we've had students who score very similarly on 19 to the real exam, and we've had students who score 25 points lower on 19 because the difficulty is just it weighs on them a lot and they're not able to handle it. But we do have a sense for Form 19 what the correction is. It's about 10 to 15 points from our population of students. But for the newer forms, and it's going to be 23 and 24 soon as well, it really, our advice is really going to just depend on our own knowledge of these exams and our general feel. And going back to Form 19, when we first analyzed it, this was before there was any sense that it was particularly hard. The consensus among our group of tutors who analyzed it was, wow, this is the hardest test we've seen. And the score that was spit out was quite low. And so that was kind of a premonition of things to come. But yeah, I mean, UWorld number 2 is great. Keep it. UWorld number 1 tends to inflate scores by a lot. So 19 underpredicts. The new forms will likely underpredict. UWorld 1 is going to overpredict. So don't, rejoice prematurely if you get a 240 or 250 or some lofty score on number 1 that can overpredict scores by 15, 20 points or more. But UWorld number 2, keep that for the end. That's going to be very helpful for you.
Okay, UWorld number 2. So another question. if you recommend one NBME to be accurate predictor of step one score, what would it be? I guess including all the possibilities that are available. So.
What I'm going to say I'm going to say Form 18, and it sounds like, oh, well, that's the one that NBME kept. That's why it's the best. This is one of those things where, again, the way things seem is not necessarily the way things are. I mean, we have contacts in this field, and we know people who work at UWorld, and we know people who work for the NBME, and we have some additional information about why Form 18 is the one that's left, and it has nothing to do with Form 18 being the best score predictor. We just, for the sake of confidence, we won't necessarily say how we know that, but Form 18 is highly predictive just from our own data. Our students who take 18 tend to score very similarly on the real exam, but Form 17 is also predictive, and 16 and 15. They're really all fine. So for those of you who've kept those exams, the older exam, purchased them before, you can use them. But for those of you who are listening thinking like, oh my God, I missed my opportunity, I didn't purchase the exam, 18 is great. It's the one that's left, and it probably also is the most accurate. So certainly keep that one as well. Don't use that to set your baseline if you're entering your study period. Keep Form 18 for when you really need to assess whether you're ready to take the test. And there's a principle, you guys, for those of you who are still second years, you'll maybe hear it next year, this idea of, when do you order a test? And I remember learning it from my residents, from attendings, this idea that you don't just order imaging because why not? Like, why not order a CT? That seems like the right thing to do. The question you always ask yourself is, how is this going to change management? What am I looking for? And if I see X on the CT, I'm going to treat the patient like this way, or if I see Y, I'm going to do the other thing. So with NBMEs, you should always be asking yourself, how is a score going to change my approach? If I score below a certain value, will I postpone my exam? Will I, rearrange my third year schedule? If it's just taking a test because you want practice, that's not as important as taking the NBME with a purpose. So if there's some time where you really need that information about whether you're ready to meet your goal, that's when you want to save the most reliable test. That's when you want to save Form 18. That's when you want to save UWorld self-assessment too. So really ask yourself, how am I going to use the information from this test to make an important decision about my study plan?
Yeah, additional question on that is something that we've seen sort of pop up. There's sort of a hidden extra resource, I think, out there that we haven't really talked about. That I think that there's an oldie but goodie and really gets overlooked a lot, and maybe can help those people, particularly who might not have access to all these tests later on. Like they might not have NBME 18 in mid-July. Can you talk to us about that one?
Absolutely, right. So what I think Dr. Verstremer is getting at is the free 120 questions that are put out there. So this has been available for a long time. Every year the NBME updates these sample questions, and when we started tutoring 2009, 2010, there was a sense among students of, I want to go to Prometric and take these questions. You can actually go to Prometric and get familiar with the software and do the 120. For some students, that's very important. For other students, it's not as important. But what every student should do, and what often gets overlooked, is working through those questions. Because if you look at the style of those questions, they actually feel a little different from the NBMEs. The vignettes are longer. We said that the vignettes on these newer forms are pretty short, just like all the old NBMEs. And although that's consistent with what we had in the past, I mean, there are some questions on the actual step one that are a little longer, and you get more of that practice when you do the 120. And a lot of our students over the past few years have actually said that those 120 questions were the most realistic for the real exam. And it's unfortunate because many students just overlook it with all the NBMEs and UWorld and all these other materials. So for sure, no matter what plan you come up with for how you take NBMEs and how you study, make sure you work through those 120 questions, make sure you understand the answers, and that will serve you pretty well, because you can imagine that your test is going to look a little bit like that.
Yeah, I think that those are really, really excellent questions. As far as like what students can do to account for this sort of movement towards anatomy-based learning or anatomy-based questions that we suspect is happening on the test, do we have some kind of strategy that we think we can use for that?
So it's interesting you mentioned that that's not one of the sample topics I mentioned, but it is totally true. So as part of the increased clinical focus that we've seen in the questions, it's not just the topics you know, like we said, some of the testing, MR angiography. We're also seeing questions written in a more clinical way and testing more imaging-based conditions. So not so much where you're given an image, like you're given a CT scan and you have to interpret it like a radiologist. You never had to be a radiologist to take step one. You still do not have to be a radiologist or a pathologist. That has not changed. But what does seem to be the case is that you're given, you know, at least from the new NBMEs, you're given a lot more images of pathologies that you wouldn't have had before. For example, rectus sheath hematoma or myosarcomas, and actually needing to correlate the anatomy that you see on a CT or an X-ray to a higher level, not a radiologist level, but a slightly higher level. So the question is, how do you prepare for that? One thing is to sort of double down on anatomy. You don't need to get out your anatomy text, grants like Atlas or anything like that, but you should definitely pay attention to the anatomy in first aid. That section has expanded over the years. You should definitely pay attention to the anatomy in New World, specifically MSK anatomy. We see that tested a lot. Neuroanatomy remains a big area. And I don't know, I mean, so Marcel, what else would you advise about that from your perspective as a radiologist who knows the anatomy
for
very
perspective
well?
as a radiologist, again, when you look at any imaging that's tested on any NBME step one question, try to think not in terms of, do I recognize the disease process, but just say, do I know the anatomy here? If I'm looking at a chest X-ray, can I identify the major parts of the heart and mediastinum? Do I know those areas? When I'm looking at the leg, can I name the major muscles and the major blood vessels and the bone? When I'm looking at the abdomen and the chest, particularly on CT scans or MRI scans that are like those sort of cross sections, can I name the major organs? As far as picking the actual disease, don't worry about it. The disease will be pretty obvious. One of the organs will probably be frankly abnormal, or they'll just refer to that organ, and then you'll have to point to it. Or if you know which organ is frankly abnormal and you don't have to make the diagnosis, it should probably point to the right direction in terms of the answer on the test. So focus on the anatomy, not so much the pathology that the imaging shows. The pathology imaging is usually complicated. There is another question actually with regards to the free 120, and I think I have the answer, but I'd love to hear yours. It says, in regards to the free 120, can we look over the answers at home after taking the exam at Prometric? With regards to that.
Sure. I mean, the questions, even though you can take it at Prometric, the questions are freely released. There's a PDF that you can download from the USMLE site, and you can review the questions and the answers whenever you want. There are no explanations. There's just an answer key. And many of the questions stay the same from year to year, but we have actually noticed in recent years that there have been some new questions. And so there is this sense that it's being updated. And one thing, you know, that you'll find in those questions that we didn't mention for the new NBMEs, there are maybe a few more ethics questions. The first aid has expanded to include the so-called safety science and hospital type, you know, quality measures and sort of the questions that a lot of students are scratch their heads on are thinking like, what is this? This is not, you know, pathology or not pharmacology. But the reality is that there are not that many of those questions. So you will see some of them in the free 120. You'll see a couple of them in the newer exams, but that's not really making that much of a difference. And again, first aid is your best resource. First aid 2019 has a lot of that information. First aid, you know, from 4 or 5 years ago didn't have it. So first aid is staying current with these changes. And if you make sure you know what's in first aid, then you'll be in good shape for, you know, for all the updated slight differences in behavioral science or whatever the topic. So that's veers a little bit away from, you know, the question that we had before. But yes, you know, you can get those questions at home. And if you do take it per metric, absolutely, you should still review them at home. And if you don't understand them, reach out to a friend or someone who can work with you and help you, because, and that's actually, that holds true for the NBMEs too. I mean, we, obviously, you know, we do tutoring, we work with students, and we spend a lot of time going through NBMEs, but we know not everyone is going to do tutoring, and not everyone certainly needs tutoring. But it is important that wherever you are, whatever your approach to studying, that you either talk with a peer, you have a little study group, or you just spend the time to research those questions, because it's not just taking the NBMEs new or old, it's understanding the answers, understanding how the question is put together, that's really what you need to do, not just, because we've seen some students who just take these tests again and again. And that is our fear, that there's certain students who are just going to take all 10 available exams, the old ones and the new ones, and just power through them and not review them. That's not helpful. That's actually counterproductive, because there's a cost to that. The cost is you're not doing UWorld, you're not reading explanations, you're not doing flashcards, Anki, first aid. So, if you are going to do NBME, make sure that it's high quality time, and that means spending plenty of time to review, at least as long. If it takes you 4 hours to take a test, at least 4 hours should be spent reviewing it carefully and researching the answers.
Sure. Actually, in my research regarding the free 120, there are no official answer sets up yet, and we have not yet done our full review of that, largely because the test didn't change as much and didn't provide the kind of score reporting. So we focused our efforts on the other NBMEs. However, there is a neuroradiology colleague I learned, somebody that I know through, I have common connections with in the world of neuroradiology where I practice, who has provided short form answers online. I reached out to him, and hopefully we'll be connecting with him, and then maybe working with him if possible to expand those explanations and provide and make sure that those are correct and that they fulfill the needs of the community. Sort of a community service. He is someone who's not involved in USMLE education like we are actively, but it seems like from reaching out to him that this is a good resource. And so you should be hearing more from us on this. We'll probably be posting some information on our blog page about the free 120 and about explanations for the free 120, so that you can be more efficient with your time when you use it to review. A question from a question from a panel, from one of the people attending this webinar. If I'm currently using an older version of first aid, is there any way I can go about compensating for the behavioral/ethics topics that may be missing? And I guess if the person who submitted this could just comment on which year they're using, if it's 2017, 18, or 2019. But how would you? Okay, 2017. So someone is using a 2017 first aid. How would they compensate for the missing?
2017 is still pretty new. So first aid evolves over the years. I mean, first aid has been a resource since the 90s for students. And if you compare the 1995 first aid to 2019, it's going to be a huge difference. But from year to year, or even over 2 or 3 years, it's not a huge difference. Just like the exam itself. I mean, we've analyzed NBMEs that were released before 2010, and some of them don't look that different, at least for many of the questions. So I wouldn't worry if I have a 2017 version of first aid. The behavioral science is quite up to date. Generally, if you're starting the process, you get the newest version of first aid. But if it's 1 or 2 years old, and a lot of students have markings in it, they've taken notes, they're comfortable, that from our experience, that does not put students at a disadvantage. If you are worried though, there are usually PDFs floating around. You can ask your classmates, and you can try to get PDF of 2019 and just take a quick look at the behavioral science. But I actually, on my computer, I have an old 2017, and it has a pretty robust behavioral science section. And I think any student would be fine with that. And
yeah, I think that's a great, you don't feel compelled to throw away your old first aid and go out and buy the brand new one if it's only a year or 2 out of date. Things don't change that much, but if you're trying to rely on something from 4 or 5 years ago, it's not that the medicine has changed, but that the quality of the diagrams it may be substantially less. So they seem to constantly improve those. There was another question regarding setting a good NBME to set a base score. Which one would you, if you were starting your studying, which NBME might you use for your base score, as opposed to like your one of your last 2 exams before?
It's a good question. We've been talking about that. I just can go over that briefly again, because that's the most immediate concern for many of you who are entering your study periods. So as we were saying, Form 18 off limits. Form 18, you need to save that for closer to your exam to decide whether you're ready to meet your goals. Setting a baseline that's too low is actually not that terrible, because better to have it be a little lower, and then that really will motivate you and sort of light a fire, than for it to be too high and to give you an artificial sense of confidence that isn't warranted. So if you're setting a baseline low, you probably should not use a UWorld assessment. Number 2, you need close to the exam. Number 1 is way too high to that point. So if you have purchased an older test form, 15, even 13, 15, 16, or 17, I would use one of those because that will set a reliable baseline. If you haven't purchased those older ones, I would use 20, 21, or 22 and just understand that it may, you know, beat you up a little bit and the score will be on the lower side, but that's okay. Scores are usually low at the beginning. But if you have, you know, if you purchase the older exams, definitely use one of those because that's the most reliable predictor, as we've been saying.
Okay. Yeah, I don't definitely that definitely really important. So let's just summarize. 18 is important, and we have to save for near the end because that's our most reliable measure. And then up front, we want to use something that's a good measure, maybe one of the older ones if you have that available, or using say a UWorld self-assessment number 2 rather than number 1 because you don't want to over-predict your score up front. It's better to sort of beat yourself up a little bit at the beginning so that you can get the confidence boost later, and potentially use the NBME 20, 21, or 22, which appear to be very hard as your base exam. Another question is that comes up with this regard is, so that UWorld self-assessments 1 and 2, is it clear that UWorld self-assessment 2 just tends to be a more reliable exam in terms of score prediction than UWorld 1?
It's not official on UWorld site by any means, but it's based on what our students have said. And also if you go on message boards and students post about their scores, and you can't always rely on that, but there is often a lot of good information. Many of you listening have probably checked those boards, and certainly more information is better because you only know what your experience is, and when you hear from others, it broadens your perspective. So yes, both based on our internal data and based on anecdotally what students seem to say, UWorld number 2 is more predictive. Actually, what we hear the most and what we see the most is that the last NBME underpredicts, UWorld number 2 slightly overpredicts, and then the real score is sandwiched somewhere in between. But everyone has a different experience, and this is actually, it brings up another point. This is not particular to the new NBMEs, but because we have an audience here listening, and what we've been doing for the last 8-9 years, we give advice to students about how to study, and we think about these exams. It's very important to understand if you're beginning this journey, your step 1 journey, that your practice scores will likely fluctuate. In fact, Dr. Bruschhamer and I, when we were at the AMC conference this past 2018 in Austin, there was a whole presentation about an academic lecture about NBMEs and the experience at a school where they pooled a lot of data, and they looked at how students were doing. And they found, I think, like 80 to 90% of their students had fluctuated on their NBMEs. So many students feel like the trend should be linear up. They feel like, okay, I took a practice test end of March, and now I've been studying full time for 3 weeks, so I presumably I should go up another 10 to 20 points. And when they stay the same or go down, it can be very disheartening. So this is, again, just advice independent of newer versus older NBMEs. Expect that your scores will go up and down, and don't live or die with that number. The question for you, 2 questions. One, are you generally seeing an upward trend? Are you generally moving in the right direction? And the other question is, are you learning from your mistakes? As long as you're learning from your mistakes on the NBMEs, and certainly for UWorld questions as well, then you're moving in the right direction. So if you're generally trending up with some volatility, and if you're always diligently reviewing the exams, you're okay. But do not expect that there'll be linear upward improvement. That's when students really get psychologically deflated. That's when, and that can affect, their studying. So just if you go in with the right mindset that this is going to be hard, there's going to be ups and downs, then you won't go off the rails when you see something that you're not expecting. So that's separate, but it is an important advice, I think, since we are talking NBMEs.
Right. No, it's definitely. I think that's a great point. You shouldn't put too much stock into just one exam in the midst of your full-time studying. On the other hand, one of the things we saw at that double AMC meeting from one of the panelists who did research on this is that there is a natural sort of bump up level somewhere in the midpoint of your dedicated study period. And if that doesn't occur after, and it really depends on the nature of how your school structures your dedicated study period, but if there's no sort of period at which you make that leap, that's when you can potentially get concerned if you're not making the progress you want. There is a point at which most students sort of get an aha moment, and after maybe say 2 or 3 practice exams, they make a big bump up to the next level. So that's something that you have to monitor yourself, and sort of you may want to talk to students in your school who've done that. And then if that doesn't happen, or if that's not happening, that's when you may want to reach out for additional help. And so obviously there are a lot of options regarding that. I don't see any more questions from our attendees at this point. If there are any more questions, it'd be great to submit them. We have a couple more minutes left before we're gonna sign off from this webinar. This is being recorded, and as long as there's no technical issues, we'll be able to post this online. Link to the blog post. Also, we'll be putting up some written material that helps summarize some of the great points that were made. If there are any more questions from any panelists, it'd be great for you.
Before everyone signs off here. The analysis that we've given, this is very preliminary. I mean, we look at these exams carefully. They've only been released in the last week. So we haven't really had a chance to do a deep dive into topical breakdown, question breakdown, charting, current trends versus past trends. A lot of this is sort of based on our first look and our experience with the exams, but we are going to be continuing the analysis for the benefit of our own students, lecture students, and one-on-one, but also, we want to make sure that you guys out there can benefit from that as well. And so we're going to be continuing to post on our blog about the new NBMEs, our insights. If we find out any information related to 23 and 24, we'll share that as well. But we take a really rigorous approach to these. We feel like that's one of the most important things that we as tutors do with students, really helping them to maximize the utility from these exams. And so you can expect that, over the coming weeks and months, there's going to be more analysis, more insight that we're going to post on our blog. Nothing that violates the intellectual property of the NBME. We're not going to post NBME questions. That would not be right. But within reason, we're going to share our insights so you guys can benefit and use it to the best you can with your own studying.
Yeah, those are excellent points. So we're not going to be providing things that would break the confidentiality of the NBME, but we are going to continue to look at these exams, and we'll be also monitoring commentary that goes online in different forums and try to get a good sense of what's going on from the general public. And then, of course, our own students, we track their scores very closely as part of our standard process with a score table. We'll be trying to make correlations and then produce, hopefully have some reliable information to release to everybody out there via our blog page. Okay, I think noticing that there are no more questions at this point, I think it'd be a good time to wrap it up. I want to say thank you everybody for joining us. I'm Dr. Bruce Raymer with Elite Medical Prep, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen today on a Sunday in early April. Late March, beginning of April. Tomorrow's I guess the beginning of the next month. And Dr. Rubin, I don't know if you have any closing words you want to say before we sign off.
I really appreciate that so many of you guys took the time to tune in and ask questions or just listen and absorb what you can. If you have any questions, if you want to continue the dialogue, certainly if you're interested in any kind of tutoring, we're always available. You can email us at info@elitemedicalprep.com, and we'll get back to you. But we are spending a lot of time and a lot of brain power thinking about these exams, building our own curriculum, which in many ways is modeled off of NBMEs. I don't know if Dr. Verschamer went into that. So we think there's no better way to attempt to understand the format of the test, the design of the test, because when it comes down to it, you're not just talking medicine, you're taking a standardized exam, and the questions are asked in a repeatable way. And so that is kind of the basis for our own tutoring. And as I said, we're happy to share these insights with you and happy that you guys were able to attend today.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, everybody. I'm going to sign off now, and the recording will hopefully be up in a couple of days, if not sooner. Okay, take care, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Good luck.
Bye.